helping to get a very successful mahjong tournament.
It was lots of fun. Thank you, Judy.
Glad you participated. We're hoping to do another one after Passover, just because we had so much fun.
Yeah, it was. It was not a lot of guys. It was not a guy.
Me too.
I know. I said not as much of a guy thing. I don't know.
Well, you should learn. You would like it, and then you could play with us.
I know, but it's
He's
something,
too competitive. It would not be fun.
something my wife enjoys, and it's something.
I'm competitive. I could beat him.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you could beat him, but
I've seen some of these women. They're the ladies that are playing. They're out for blood. But I that definitely let Tracy enjoy that as a area that she can live in, and I don't know if she wants me to enter that. We never talked about it as something we could share. She seems to enjoy it with her friends. Yeah, she enjoys it. But and we've done that, she's done that with virtually too. She's played a few times. And it's nice to see people are able to do that online. And I guess on our end, we played poker a couple times. I think only 2 or 3 times, but I know some people are playing it all the time. But yeah, there's people making the most out of these opportunities, and probably will continue. Being able to play mahjong or poker with people around the country and friends, and being able to connect. Definitely we were playing poker for fun, not so much. There was money involved, a little bit more than the mahjong, but not that much. And it was more.
No, our awards this time were big.
Yes, we were in a little bit in that range, but yeah, I think you guys, if we can keep those things going where we're connecting to people, that's a really good thing. I'm going to share this up. I know we're still waiting. Some people are still jumping on or still getting out of bed on this cold morning. This is one of the mornings where people are probably comfy under their sheets a little bit, but
you just need to put a shirt on and then come to class. It's not too bad.
You don't have to roll out that far, but we that is true. I have to say too, again, I hope everyone's taking care of their health and everything like that. It's definitely gotten better. I know it's gotten better only from the standpoint of I haven't had many funerals to do lately, which is one of the ways
good
kind of take notice of how things are getting, because it definitely was a tough month last month. So hopefully February will stay trending the way it's trending. I know everybody says it's trending down, but I can tell you from my vantage point, from the unfortunate vantage point sometimes of officiating at funerals, pretty interesting. By the way, speaking of funerals and things out there, I'm not a big let me start off by saying this. I'm not a big podcasting person. I don't follow many podcasts. I'm not in that podcast sphere, but there's a really good podcast that I follow because I followed the books. Is the Freakonomics podcast. Stephen Dobner does. And it's pretty good. He has good guests and they cover good subjects about society, economics, but more society. And they've done some really good ones about dining and about COVID and about just kind of macro things that people think about or don't think about, but should. And they had an episode, their last episode was about death. And they had a woman who's written and has her own social media following. Her name is Caitlin Doty, and she's from LA. And she owns a undertaking company here in LA, and she talked about death and how we deal with death in the United States. It was a really interesting, she's got some very interesting observations. She's an intelligent, very articulate woman who talks about a subject that we don't talk very much about. We're going to talk about it today because, well, it's in the Midrash all the time, but it's important to think about, not just in the sphere of COVID, but in a spiritual sphere. Some people would argue again, or she does, that death is really the thing that we think about even when we don't want to say we're thinking about it. It's the thing that lays out there and is the basis for, again, religion or what drives us and overall our economics and how we live our lives. So anyways, if you want to check it out, Judith also recommends Lady History, which is a podcast hosted by Alana. And that's pretty cool that Alana is maintaining that. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of it's a great thing to do to
Got her into grad school.
be able to think and teach. And I think it's really cool for those areas that people don't oftentimes have a venue for, because in the old days, if you didn't have something that could reach the masses, and that's one of the real democratizing factors of the new media, is the ability for people to get their message out. And you never know what sticks, by the way. So we are going to talk a little bit about death today, because, well, we talked about it last week and the week before and the week before that, and that is the plagues. That is the death of the firstborn, was what we read last week. And the final, I guess you could say, the next step towards Exodus, towards the mass immigration moment as we leave Egypt. But today we come to the end of this. And again, the way that Ginsburg had originally assembled these together, this is actually the end.
I just have a shower. Sorry, I have a dentist appointment.
Oh, that's okay. This is the end of, thanks, Sandy. I'm glad you're here. This is the end of a chapter or a volume.
I'll give it to you again. It's okay. 661
Okay,
613 8085.
I didn't know she was muted. Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of a volume for Ginsburg. He ended one of his volumes with the redemption. So you're going to see that we're actually going to move out of a volume today on this online. This is the online version of it, but it's follows the version that he had. So this is the redemption. This is right after the 10th plague is over.
No, I don't know. I don't remember receiving it. I would have sent it back. Normally I'm pretty good at that.
This is right after the 10th plague, right after, that's what we ended with last time. And it again segues right in, talking about, again, reflecting on this last plague, the death of the firstborn, and the fact that this is what gives us that final permission to leave. As we know, as we talk about every year at Passover, which is only about 6 weeks away. All right. And again, another time where we're going to be thinking about leaving, getting free. So that's on our heads as well. So Rosemary, do you want to start off after the plague of the death of the firstborn? So you're going to read a little bit about Pharaoh's reaction to this plague. And as we know from Hollywood, I'd say modern Hollywood, every great movie has to have, or at least action movie has to have, a really good villain. And if the villain isn't great, makes the work of the hero not as exciting and not as glamorous. And there's a reason why in Hollywood today, people are striving to be the villain. I think, Jack Nicholson was one of the first to turn that into a multi-million-dollar proposition, and also one where a lot of people remember who's the villain. It's sometimes not as easy to remember who the hero is. So in these movies nowadays, didn't used to be the case. Back in the day, they were guys who were always villains in movies. Nowadays, the big actors are oftentimes looking for that meaty superhero villain in the Marvel blockbuster. And that's what we have this week, the meaty villain role of Pharaoh. So let's read it. Rosemary.
Pharaoh rose up in the night of the smiting of the firstborn. He waited not for the 3rd hour of the morning, when kings usually arise, nor did he wait to be awakened, but he himself roused his slaves from their slumber and all the other Egyptians, and together they went forth to seek Moses and Aaron. He knew that Moses had never spoken an untruth, and as he had said, I will see your face again no more, he could not count upon Moses coming to him. There remained for him nothing to do but go in search of the Israelitish leader. He did not know where Moses lived, and he had great difficulty and lost much time in looking for his house. For the Hebrew lads of whom he made inquiries when he met them in the street played practical jokes on him, misdirected him, and led him astray. Thus he wandered about for a long time, all the while weeping and crying out, "Oh, my friend Moses, pray for me to God."
Yeah, so that's kind of a humorous scene where Pharaoh is, oh God, I mean, the Torah says, Moses said, well, Pharaoh said, don't let me see your face again anymore, you'll die. And Moses says, yeah, you're right. And so Pharaoh now has to find Moses. Now, this part isn't in the Torah, but is opened up by this issue of Moses saying, I'm not coming. Yeah, I won't come back here anymore. You're right. I'm not going to come back here anymore. So how does this get set up then? Because the Torah does recount that they have another conversation. So Pharaoh is Pharaoh. He can change his mind. So they definitely allow for that, but they also have to deal with the fact that Moses did say this and did put it into this, Moses, and therefore God must have said, we're not going to see each other anymore. So the Midrash then kind of will figure out how does that happen, because the Torah does recount a conversation that they have, the final confrontation, which is, yeah, you can go now, take your stuff with you, and just get out quick. And so the Midrash makes a little fun of that, which is now Pharaoh wakes up. He's not even relying on his servants anymore, and he has to go and find him. And even the kids are making fun of him now at this point. So it's gotten that bad for Pharaoh, and it's going to get worse in the Midrash, because the Midrash is going to play with him. But again, always remind us, can't make him too powerless, because he's a villain, and we need to have a good villain. So, and the big thing is still out there. So as big as the plagues are, there's still one more thing happening, and you know it. The rabbis know it. Everybody who reads the story knows it. And by the way, perhaps the most important, or the oldest, or the text that if you will, was the liberation text, was the Red Sea, which we may not get to today, but that might have been the story that was the big story even before we had the plagues, was the Red Sea. So keep that in mind, that everything is really still building, as much as the 10th plague was kind of the ultimate. Not really, because the ultimate is about to happen. So here we go.
Meanwhile, Moses and Aaron and all Israel beside were at the Paschal meal, drinking wine as they sat and leaned to one side, and singing songs in praise of God, the Hallel, which they were the first to recite. When Pharaoh finally reached the door of the house where Moses abode, he called to him, and from Moses the question came back, "Who are you, and what is your name?" "I am Pharaoh, who stands here humiliated." Moses asked again, "Why do you come to me yourself? Is it the custom of kings to linger at the doors of common folk?" "I pray you, my lord," returned Pharaoh, "come forth and intercede for us, else there will not remain a single being in Egypt." "I may not come forth, for God has commanded us, none of you shall go out the door of his house until the morning." But Pharaoh continued to plead, "Do but step to the window and speak with me." And when Moses yielded to his importunities and appeared at the window, the king addressed these words to him: "You did say yesterday, all the firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, but now as many as 9/10 of the inhabitants have perished."
Yeah, so that's an interesting midrash, which is that it didn't just kill the firstborn, right? It killed other people who were maybe not the firstborn of their father, but also the firstborn of their mother. And as we read in the Midrash last week, the Egyptians were notorious for having children out of wedlock. And so some guy who had kids a bunch of places, or women who had kids with a bunch of people, they had more than one kid die because they were notoriously playing around. So that's a weird one, right? There are weirder, by the way, because there are midrashim that a lot of Jews died that night too, who didn't put the blood on their doors or who didn't leave Egypt. But yeah, this idea that there was more death than just the firstborn, or that would obviously have died in a plague like that, where you'd go, well, if you have 4 or 5 kids, 20% of the population died, maybe. Not according to this, and not according to, again, this kind of idea that the plague was limited, but not as limited as you would have thought. Because again, there's this the midrash that we read last week that says, why do we even have to have more people die? Well, first of all, it's making fun of the Egyptian behavior, and probably wasn't making fun of the Egyptian behavior, but actually making fun of the Romans, who were the rabbis' real targets in some cases when they're talking about the Egyptians. They're really talking about the Romans. But there's also this kind of idea that maybe a guy like Pharaoh, because he seems to be like this, he's willing to say, I'll lose 10%, 20% of my population. I don't care. He doesn't seem to care for 9 plagues. He keeps changing his mind. So maybe Pharaoh will do the calculation and say, yeah, I'm willing to lose 20% of my population. I mean, ruthless dictators make those kinds of calculations and seem to be okay with it, right? So that's kind of what the rabbis assume here, is that maybe it was worse, and it would have had to have been worse for Pharaoh to finally say, I'm done. So here's Pharaoh coming around. He comes around and it's still dark out, which is of course wild, because Pharaoh couldn't wait until morning, had to get them out right away. And they're still celebrating Passover. And of course, this is the first Passover, but they're already doing things that we're doing at our later Passovers, including singing Hallel, which again are psalms, which assumedly were written hundreds of years later. But the rabbis say, no, some of Hallel was written that night. That was the first night that this Hallel was sung. And it was sung because Jews were very happy that they were leaving Egypt. So all those Hallel that refers back to the Exodus, like Psalm 114 and Psalm 136 and all these great psalms that we still do at Passover that talk about Exodus, yeah, those were actually done that night, and not written by later kings or commissioned by later kings. But so, there is an argument to be made that it's kind of cool that Jews were still singing about it hundreds of years later, thousands of years ago, which is something to be said for that. But there's also, I guess, something to be said for the fact that, no, it goes back to the original first Passover. So Pharaoh's out there at night trying to get Moses and the Israelites out. And he's not coming into the door because Moses says, we're not opening the door until Passover is passed over. And no, you're not coming in. Even Pharaoh isn't coming in. So they talk through the window. So therefore, Pharaoh also and Moses have a conversation, but not face to face. All right, well, here's another interesting midrash about who comes along with Pharaoh on this little mission of mercy.
Pharaoh was accompanied by his daughter Bithiah, Moses' foster mother. She reproached him with ingratitude in having brought down evil upon her and her countrymen. And Moses answered and said, 10 plagues the Lord brought upon Egypt. Has evil accrued to you from any of them? Did one of them affect you? And when Bithiah acknowledged that no harm had touched her, Moses continued to speak. Although you are your mother's firstborn, you shall not die, and no evil shall reach you in the midst of Egypt. But Bithiah said, of what advantage is my security to me when I see the king, my brother, and all his household and his servants in this evil plight, and look upon their firstborn perishing with all the firstborn of Egypt? And Moses returned, verily, your brother and his household and the other Egyptians would not hearken to the words of the Lord. Therefore did this evil come upon them.
So this is a story that's not in the Torah, which is a really interesting story that kind of is based on, I want to know this conversation. I want to know, assuming that Moses's foster mother, this wonderful Egyptian woman whose name was originally Bat Paro, but according to the Midrash, we never learn her name, that it comes Batya. Batya means the daughter of God. So the daughter of Pharaoh becomes the daughter of God. Now, this daughter of Pharaoh, of course, is also Pharaoh's sister. And so, well, not of course, we don't know for sure, which also, by the way, could have meant that he could have been, right, his wife by Egyptian law. But it seems as though, again, they, at least her kid wasn't killed, so they didn't have that kid together, which would have been Moses's, in a weird way, Moses's, I guess Moses's half brother / cousin, whatever. But the family dynamic here is what the rabbis are focusing on, which is, what did that conversation look and sound like when Moses's Egyptian foster mother, this woman that he loves, that loved him, what does she say to Moses after this 10th plague? Or, you can make the argument all along during these plagues. What's her position as the Egyptian who's done only good things for Moses? Now she is defending her people. They're her people. And so again, in the Midrash, we have Moses, when she says this to Moses and says, again, you're hurting my country. Moses says, nothing's happened to you. Nothing. You're protected by God. You've done the right thing and you've been protected. And she says, but these are my people. I can't sit by and not say something. And so that's where Moses says, look, they had a chance. You could make the argument though the Midrash we read last week seems to indicate that God knew better, but technically speaking, if the people even put blood on their door, maybe you could say there's a stream of this that you could get, that the Midrash or the Torah even would allow for those people to be saved if they had put the blood on their door, maybe. So maybe Egyptians who got right with God weren't even affected by this plague. But it's an interesting discussion. It's a discussion that you might have wanted to have, which is what kind of situation was Moses's Egyptian foster mother in this moment, this night of Passover. So in some versions of the story, she's there at Passover with him. Actually, in the movie The Ten Commandments, Bithia is sitting with Moses at the Seder. So this is a interesting thing to imagine. What was it like for her? And we have it. I mean, we have at least a version of it. How can you let my people die? So, and it just gives Moses another opportunity to say, look, they had a chance. This didn't have to happen. So.
Turning to Pharaoh, Moses said, in spite of all that has happened, I will teach you something if you desire to learn, and you will be spared and you will not die. Raise your voice and say, you children of Israel, you are your own masters. Prepare for your journey and depart from among my people. Hitherto you were slaves of Pharaoh, but henceforward you are under the authority of God. Serve the Lord, your God. Moses made him say these words 3 times, and God caused Pharaoh's voice to be heard throughout the land of Egypt, so that all the inhabitants, the homeborn and the aliens, knew that Pharaoh had released the children of Israel from the bondage in which they had languished. And all Israel sang, Hallelujah, praise, O you servants of the Lord, praise the name of the Lord. For they belonged to the Lord, and no more were the servants of Pharaoh.
Yep. So what we have here is an important moment where Pharaoh has to say the words. It's not just people left, but that Pharaoh says you're free. So what you get it from the Torah, but you get it very explicitly that part of what happened here was Pharaoh owned the Jews and he turns over ownership to God. And that's the way it's put here, is that Pharaoh says, so that the people can hear it too. Pharaoh proclaimed, you're now serving God and not me. So interesting, right? This is the moment of transfer, if you will. Here we go.
Now the king of Egypt insisted upon their leaving the land without delay. But Moses objected and said, are we thieves that we should slink away under cover of the night? Wait until morning. Pharaoh, however, urged and begged Moses to depart, confessing that he was anxious about his own person, for he was a firstborn son, and he was terrified that death would strike him down too. Moses dissipated his alarm, though he substituted a new horror with the words, fear not, there is worse in store for you. Dread seized upon the whole people. Every one of the Egyptians was afraid of losing his life, and they all united their prayers with Pharaoh's and begged Moses to take the Israelites hence. And God spoke, you shall all find your end not here, but in the Red Sea.
Yep. So here it's made really clear that there's more to come. This is the kind of the ultimate. Now, the people leaving Egypt at the time didn't know there was a Red Sea. We don't know that. The Torah doesn't actually tell us that Moses is going to know that there's a Red Sea. But what the Midrash just did is says that Moses knows that there's going to be a Red Sea and that there's more coming, which is, I don't know if that's ruining the story, because it's more dramatic when you don't know that it's going to happen. I guess you can make the argument, but the rabbis want to know that, I guess they want you to know explicitly that this is why, again, Pharaoh has to be, that has to sit out there. And again, you can make the argument that's what the part that everybody really knew anyways, and still knows, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. That's why it's the big moment. It's the big budget. It's the big budget moment. By the way, when DeMille did the 10 Commandments in 56, this is obviously where he spent the money, right? The big budget on the parting of the Red Sea. But they wanted the plagues to look dramatic too. He wanted those plagues to stay, keep people's attention and get people, make people scared and got to be awed by it. But he knew, DeMille knew what was coming as the director. And you can make the argument that God as the director knows what's going to happen and wants these things to build up to the crescendo, the real crescendo. By the way, last year, obviously 10 Commandments is shown every year. I just looked at the viewership. It's gone down over the last 15, 20 years, but there were still 5 million people that watched the Exodus 10 Commandments on television this last Passover, April 4th, it came out, always Passover, Easter time. But what's interesting, of course, is that means a lot of Gentiles are watching the Exodus as well, 10 Commandments as well, as focusing on this story. I also just looked up because I was curious. Nina Falk, who played Bithia in the movie, Moses's mother, was 1 year younger than Charlton Heston. She was born in 1924 and Heston was born in 23. So she was, they had her playing slightly different ages, I guess, in the movie, but they had to have her there at the beginning, finding Moses as a baby, and then they had the, you know, they had that, you know, going. But it was kind of weird that all the women stars of that movie were all within about a year or two of each other. You know, Anne Baxter as Nefertiti as the Egyptian prince queen, and then remember who played Zipporah? Yvonne de Carlo. That's right, Yvonne de Carlo, who's around the same age too, played Zipporah. So these women are all roughly around the same age and kind of had similar, I would say, very kind of like similar careers as far as what they got to play, though. Yvonne de Carlo got to be in the Munsters, so there you go. That's pretty good. But the Exodus now, when they leave Egypt, that's what we're going to be reading today. What it was like for them when they left, and for us when we left. So we kind of skip over this part a lot there's not a lot in the Torah, so we don't really skip over it. It's just not there. What was that moment like after the morning after, and then in those few hours when we left? What was that like? And the Midrash definitely picks up on some things here that are in the Torah, but we just don't have a lot of it, especially, as you can imagine, collection day, when the Jews went around and collected the treasures of Egypt, which is very explicitly said in the Torah. That is in the Torah. It's clearly important. The rabbis have to deal with it. It leads to some questions of, I think the rabbis were a little bit, well, I can see why we were owed it, but how do you actually go around collecting this from people? The rabbis were going to talk about it now. So let's read what happens when they leave. And as, by the way, as Cheryl just put up in the chat, yes, the sets of the Ten Commandments were buried out on the beach, out by Pismo and Napomo. You can actually see some of the sets from the Ten Commandments out in the Central California area of those beaches, nice beaches up there by San Luis Obispo. Which, by the way, San Luis Obispo, for those who follow the news lately, the A Pie House there got vandalized last week with swastikas this weekend. Not last week, last few days, unfortunately. Anyways, so what happens to people who mess with us, whether it's the A Pie House or the Egyptians? Not good idea, according to the rabbis, according to the Torah, according to Jewish history. Here's what happens.
Pharaoh and the Egyptians let their dead lie unburied, while they hastened to help the Israelites load their possessions on wagons to get them out of the land with as little delay as possible. When they left, they took with them, besides their own cattle, the sheep and the oxen that Pharaoh had ordered his nobles to give them as presents. The king also forced his magnates to beg pardon of the Israelites for all they had suffered, knowing as he did that God forgives an injury done by man to his fellow only after the wrongdoer has recovered the goodwill of his victim by confessing and regretting his fault. Now depart, said Pharaoh to the Israelites. I want nothing from you but that you should pray to God for me, that I may be saved from death.
Yep. So didn't even wait for the dead to be buried. Calls them and says, that's part of, by the way, this dramatic exit, that they're literally leaving Egypt surrounded by dead bodies around them as they're walking out, which is fairly dramatic. And the Egyptians were very into obviously burying people, but not today. Not today. So the Egyptians, I don't know if you want to say, turn the page But there does seem to be this idea, at least in some rabbinic understandings, that, yeah, the Egyptians did turn the page and don't want to do wrong by Israel ever again. I don't know what to tell you other than the rabbis want to say that there is possibility to do teshuvah. They definitely want that to be there. And that maybe the Egyptians, we don't hold them accountable forever. And there is that even in the Torah, that we can allow the Egyptians to come into our community after just a few generations. It seems to be because they've turned the page, if you will. So there's forgiveness, but it requires action, and not just punishment, but actual contrition and repentance on their part, which according to this, they do. All right.
The hatred of the Egyptians toward the Israelites changed now into its opposite. They conceived affection and friendship for them, and fairly forced raiment upon them, and jewels of silver and jewels of gold to take along with them on their journey, although the children of Israel had not yet returned the articles they had borrowed from their neighbors at an earlier time. This action is in part to be explained by the vanity of Pharaoh and his people. They desired to pretend before the world that they were vastly rich, as everybody would conclude when this wealth of their mere slaves was displayed to observers. Indeed, the Israelites bore so much away from Egypt that one of them alone might have defrayed the expense of building and furnishing the tabernacle.
Wow. So
that's funny, because the Egyptians didn't need to pretend they were rich. Rich.
Yeah. So it's an interesting projection of somebody who wrote that, probably. But I mean, it's not uncommon for people.
Not uncommon for people to pretend they're rich.
Yes, it's kind of the definition of nouveau riche. Was we weren't born into it, but we've come to it lately, and the mentality is still part of human experience, right? It is the difference between, again, being born into money or having money always there, and then not having it and now having it, that it does something to people, and they can't help themselves. So that's an interesting truth, if you will. Not where you necessarily would have thought that this would come from, given the fact that they're going to spend the next generation, 40 years, the rest of that generation in the wilderness, where ain't going to buy you a whole hell of a lot. It doesn't help having a Lamborghini out in the desert, but they have money. Of course, we know what they're going to use it for, which the Midrash just threw out there, which is, this is how we get the tabernacle, from this money. So that's how we had the gold in the desert to make the tabernacle. So the money isn't going to do a whole lot in the desert. All right. But wait, there's more. With the Egyptian wealth that you think that they've got, there's even more coming. Because the Torah talks about the wealth of their neighbors, the normal private citizen, but there is more money there in Egypt, as we know.
On their leaving the land, only the private wealth of the Egyptians was in their hands. But when they arrived at the Red Sea, they came into possession of the public treasure too. For Pharaoh, like all kings, carried the monies of the state with him on his campaigns in order to be prepared to hire a relay of mercenaries in case of defeat. Great as the other treasure was, the booty captured at the sea far exceeded it.
Yep. So just in case you thought that was all they're going to get, interesting. No, they don't. They're going to get more money. They're going to get the Egyptian national money too, the money that's in their Fort Knox, if you will, because that's money that the Pharaoh brought with him to the Red Sea. That's one of the reasons why he chases them, because there's more money that's going to come to them, which is technically, you can make the argument, the money they really owed, which is the money that they've enriched the Egyptian government for centuries, or again, a very long time as slaves. The national treasury went up. So there's that money too. Which, by the way, if you're, the answer that you'd have on this would be, well, why? And they want you to know that, well, the rabbis, I'm saying, want you to know that it would be one thing if they took money from their neighbors. I guess you could say they also benefited from having slaves in their midst. But really, shouldn't the money have come from the Egyptian government? And the rabbis answer that question with, yes, it does. And so again, they could have had the money with them. And so then you get this little taste of the way things used to be in the good old days of battle. We don't do this anymore. We haven't done this for a long time, probably a couple hundred years. But when countries used to rely on mercenaries to fight for them, you had to bring the cash with you, because you paid the soldiers right there, because there was no home for them to go back to. You had soldiers that were in your employ that were your own nation. Well, sometimes they didn't have a choice. They had to be soldiers, right? They were called up as reserves or as expected soldiers in the country. They had to protect their families. But if you have mercenaries, you got to pay them, and they don't take checks. So you got to bring your money with you. So why would they have brought the money? Because definitely if you're hiring mercenaries, which you'd think, well, how would the Egyptians have mercenaries? Because they did. We know they had mercenaries, and a lot of armies did in those days. Don't forget, the British fought with mercenaries when they fought us. That's how we have those bloody Hessians. You had to pay them. And so that's how the money got there. That's why the money would have been there. And that's how the money wound up back with us at the Red Sea, how we got some extras that the Torah doesn't talk about, but everybody knows. Armies always carry some cash with them. And that is part of what also would fall into the arms of the victors, the spoils, if you will, right? Would be that money that was brought to pay armies. So there's more money coming. Let me see. There's more. Here we go.
But if the Israelites loaded themselves down with goods and jewels and money, it was not to gratify love of riches, or, as any usurer might say, because they coveted their neighbor's possessions. In the first place, they could look upon their plunder as wages due to them from those they had long served. And secondly, they were entitled to retaliate on those at whose hands they had suffered wrong. Even then, they were requiting them with an affliction far slighter than any one of all they had endured themselves.
Yep. And so here's the issue. It is restitution, but it's also punishment. It's also money spent by the Egyptians to pay for the abuse and as punitive fine for how they treated us. So the obvious thing that we always say is, well, the Egyptians owed us back wages. They didn't pay us. But there's another thing that the rabbis point out, which is that this is financial. This is literally part of their teshuvah, part of their repentance is paying this punitive amount of money for abusing us and killing us for so long, and that it's a fraction of what they owed. So interesting discussions about restitution in the Torah. Here we go.
The plagues did not stay the cruelty of the Egyptian oppressors toward the Hebrews. It continued unabated to the very end of their sojourn in the land. On the day of the Exodus, Rachel, the daughter of Shelah, gave birth to a child while she and her husband together were treading the clay for bricks. The babe dropped from her womb into the clay and sank out of sight. Gabriel appeared, molded a brick out of the clay containing the child, and carried it to the highest of the heavens, where he made it a footstool before the divine throne. In that night it was that God looked upon the suffering of Israel and smote the firstborn of the Egyptians. and it is one of the 4 nights that God has inscribed in the Book of Memorial. The first of the 4 is that in which God appeared to create the world. All was waste and void, and darkness brooded over the abyss, until the Lord came and spread light around by his word. The second night is that in which God appeared to Abraham at the covenant of the pieces. In the third night, he appeared in Egypt, slaying the firstborn of the Egyptians with his right hand and protecting the firstborn of the Israelites with his left. The fourth night recorded will be that in which the end of the redemption will be accomplished, when the iron yoke of the wicked kingdom will be broken and the evildoers will be destroyed. Then will Moses come from the desert and the Messiah from Rome, each at the head of his flock, and the word of God will mediate between them, causing both to walk with one accord in the same direction.
Well, that's weird.
Yeah.
That's a weird midrash. But it builds on midrashim that we already read and we've read before, which is that what the Egyptians did was not just kill Israelite babies, but turn them into bricks. Literally build their cities with the bones of our babies. It's a play on the word bonim, which means to build, but it also means banim. Sounds like banim, which is my sons or children. So this midrash, this theme of how horrible it was, is that, again, even on the last day, the day that they left, Jewish babies were still being turned into nothing but, I mean, this is literally like the people that died on the last week of the Holocaust, right? So it's not like the death stopped, 2 weeks before. There's so many stories of people who could have almost made it. I think Anne Frank being one of the most famous, because she was one of the most famous, but the fact that she died literally 2 weeks before the liberation of the camp that she was at. This is that story, which is, again, this is a night. Again, there are a few nights mentioned in the Torah up until that point. Now, of course, one can make the argument that last night before the liberation of the last camp of the Holocaust, or the last ghetto, or the last place where Jews were finally liberated, that could have been one of those nights. So this is the dark before the dawn, literally the last nail in the coffin, if you will, and what is going to say that's done. And of course, it makes it more dramatic if there's going to be 4. This is the third, and there's only one more. When the rabbis wrote this thousands of years ago, they were hoping that that last nail of the coffin was coming soon, coming their day. And it was this idea that the Messiah was coming soon and was going to end the Roman persecutions. When it says the Messiah from Rome, that is literally this idea that the Messiah is in Rome. During the time of the Romans, the Jewish people would ask the rabbis, their leaders, the prophets, whatever, where's the Messiah? Where is the Messiah right now? He's not here. And you have these amazing midrashim that the Messiah is actually in Rome. He's right in the heartland of the Romans. He's doing God's work. He's binding the bandages of the lepers, is one of the most famous versions of that. That he's there. He's where you least would expect it, but Messiah is there. Don't give up hope that he's there, that he's in a place you never expect him to be. You wouldn't think he's in the darkest place, but he's there. And so you have this idea that there is that time. And again, Jews kind of moved away from that. Christians never did, though this idea that the Messiah is still walking the earth that doesn't really work with Christian theology, of course, is that Jesus is in heaven waiting to come back. But the Jewish folks had an idea that the Messiah was actually still here, which existed definitely in early Christianity, that the early days of Jesus's story was that he had been resurrected and was in other places. Of course, Mormons say he came to North America, but the idea that Jesus hadn't left was part of early Christianity until, hundreds of years later, where people said, he's not here. He's got to be somewhere else. No one's seen him. Maybe he's in heaven, where again, he's waiting to come back. Made more sense because it was such an important part of the theology. These midrashim are important, but they're not the basis of our religion. These are stories that kind of help give people hope that the Messiah is there, is waiting to come back. And, maybe God is working miracles through that Messiah, but he's a hidden Messiah. He's a Messiah that don't really know where he is. He's out there. And then you get these myths of, Lamed Vavniks who are out there, who are not individual messiahs, but are part of the 36, if you will, messiahs that are keeping the world all around, and we don't know who they are. So this idea that there's like a hidden Messiah becomes an important idea in Judaism, which is that the Messiah is still a human being and could die, and totally different than the Christian idea of a Messiah. But you see these in the Midrashim, where you have these kind of intermediate stages of what the Messiah does and who he is. But again, it goes back to this idea that there are moments of darkness, and they are part of again the final or a redemption. They're the last step before something really good is going to happen, which obviously I don't want to belabor right now, but there's definitely a feeling like that right now, which is that at some point, the bad things are going to stop and we're going to turn the corner. We're going to turn the page. That's going to be the final thing. And people will start feeling better and we'll have better days. So we're definitely living in one of those periods now where we're thinking maybe that was the last, maybe that was the last thing. Maybe that was the last baby, if you will, that died. Look, there's a bigger picture towards the redemption of the world that seem to be really far away from. But then there's the little one maybe that we're asking for right now, which is just to be able to get out of our houses and be able to go back to normal. Definitely resonates this year in a way that it didn't last year when we read this part of the Torah. This is part of the Torah that we just read 2 weeks ago, Bishalach. We're reading this story of leaving Egypt. And again, there's not that much in the Torah. It's pretty much chapter 14 of the Torah, right before the Exodus. Chapters 13 and 14 are these leaving Egypt moments, which get a very interesting one here, which is, again, one more baby died. And Gabriel, the angel, keeps that. And where is it, by the way? It's right by God. That baby is right by God. That remnant of that baby is right by God. Pretty wild, right? It's a way of reminding God how the Jews suffered. So, and let's continue with this idea of not just redemption during the time of Pharaoh, the Egyptians, but redemption for the future.
Israel's redemption in future days will happen on the 15th of Nisan, the night of Israel's redemption from Egypt. For thus did Moses say, in this night God protected Israel against the angels of destruction, and in this night he will also redeem the generations of the future.
Yep. This is this idea that when will the Messiah come? When will there be redemption? The night of Passover. Because this is the night of our redemption, and it will be the night of our redemption forever. So this is pretty key, folks, because when you want to go back in time to the time of the rabbis 2,000 years ago, there's a reason why the Last Supper was a Passover meal, folks, because this idea that the redemption takes place on the 15th of Nisan, what were Jesus's followers doing, or what was Jesus doing, or what were later writers that were telling Jesus a story doing? They were connecting Jesus to the redemption, to that messianic redemption when God would redeem us again, in this case, from the Romans. So know that that was critical for why the Last Supper and why Jesus does his thing during Passover. He was saying, or his followers were saying, he is the ultimate Messiah who's now going to end the Roman occupation, because this is the night that God redeems us. And it was the reason why 77 years ago, almost 78 years ago now, folks, in 1943, that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place on this night, the night of Passover. Why the Jews of Warsaw decided to start fighting back with their last ounce of energy on the night of Passover. And so this is the night of deliverance. And every year that Jews reenacted Passover during a dark time, they were hoping, tonight, God, let this be the night. And it's the reason why every year for thousands of years, the Jewish people have opened a door, welcome in Elijah and say, Elijah, do your work. Start this process of redemption tonight. We've never stopped. We've never stopped hoping that that night of Passover one day would be the day of liberation, the day of ultimate redemption, of leaving behind all the horrible parts of our world. So it's never gone away, that hope, that night of the 15th of Nisan. So we'll hope we're at least taking one more step closer to redemption this year. And that's why Passover is not just a holiday of the past, not just working through the struggles and the redemption of our ancestors, but looking for our own redemption. Literally, that this is the night that the door opens up. So that's why Passover has such power. That this is the night that God will redeem us. So,
though the actual deliverance from Egypt took place in that night, the Hebrews did not leave the land until the following day. During the same night, God requited the Egyptians for their evil deeds in the sight of all the people, the night being as bright as day at the time of the summer solstice. Not one could escape the general chastisement, for by divine dispensation, none was absent from home at the time, so that none could fail to see the chastisement.
Yeah, so that's an interesting midrash. Yeah, it was nighttime, but it was bright as day. Everybody could see what was happening. Which again then begs the question, why didn't the Israelites leave right then? Why didn't they just go? Because this was the night of punishment. It was not the time of leaving. But don't think it was dark. God made a miracle. Everybody could see what was happening. God wanted everyone to see it. And so it was as bright as day all night. And everyone could see what was happening. This is this final punishment. Now we're going to get to a famous midrash, though this part isn't the famous part. It's a two-parter, and we're going to read the second part maybe today. I doubt it, but maybe. But I will tell you that it's a part that you might have heard. It's a pretty famous part. But this is the first part of it, which people don't know. It's a two-parter. Here we go.
The angels in heaven learned what was happening on earth. When they were about to sing their song of praise to God, he silenced them with the words, "My children on earth are singing now." And the celestial hosts had to stop and listen to the song of Israel.
So that is the angels start singing. They're so happy. They're witnessing this great redemption that God is, and they're going to start singing. God says, shh, I want to hear the people. Stop singing, angels. I want to hear the people. Which, of course, the angels don't really want to be told to shut up. They want to sing. That's what they do. That's some of them. That's all they do. It's our job. We sing. Singing God's praises. But God says, no, this is the people's time. So you stop, and people are going to sing. That's the first part of the midrash. A lot of people know the second part of the Midrash. So again, this was Moses's, this was the angels kind of stopping so that Moses and the people could do their job, singing and praising, which of course we do whenever we sing Hallel, whenever we sing the words of the Song of the Sea, which is coming up. Those songs are important songs. They're songs of freedom. But of course, it wasn't all singing and dancing.
Great as the joy of the Hebrews was at their deliverance from Egyptian bondage, it was exceeded by that of Pharaoh's people at seeing their slaves depart, for with them went the dread of death that had obsessed them. They were like the portly gentleman riding an ass. The rider feels uncomfortable and longs for the moment of alighting, but his longing cannot compare in intensity with that of the ass groaning under the corpulent burden, and when their journey's end is reached, the ass rejoices more than his master. So the Egyptians were happier to be rid of the Hebrews than these were to be free.
Interesting.
One.
The Egyptians were actually happier because we had been a burden on them during this, at least during the plague times. So as much as we were happy, the Egyptians were really happy. The Egyptians were like, oh my gosh, it's over. So it's like, again, the donkey is much happier than the rider. When everybody, there's a joke in there that I'm not going to say, but the rider gets off, his butt's feeling good, but the donkey feels much better. Yeah, you could say which ass feels better. The donkey one does. So that's what they're saying. So they're comparing the Israelites to the big guy on the donkey. So the Egyptians are happier even than we are. But there's another thing here too, which is, well, the Midrash points out, well, how exactly are the Israelites feeling at this moment?
In general, the Israelites were not in a joyous mood. The strength of men is readily exhausted, mentally and physically, by the strain of a sudden change from slavery to freedom. They did not recover vigor and force until they heard the angel hosts sing songs of praise and joy over the redemption of Israel and the redemption of the Shekinah. For so long as the chosen people is in exile, the Shekinah who dwells among Israel is also, as it were, in exile. At the same time, God caused the earth to exhale and send aloft a healing fragrance, which cured them of all their diseases.
Yes, this is the original aromatherapy. Mm-hmm. And it is something that people believed a long time ago, which is that sometimes a really good smell helps to bring us back. But it says that the Israelites were not exactly feeling great yet, because this really was bad until the last minute. It was not like you could say, well, during the plagues, the Israelites got a little break. Not according to several Midrashim, which has babies still dying the morning of redemption. So when you and I are preparing our Seder, if you will, we had that Midrash that Jewish babies were still dying. Didn't happen until that night, the next day. And even then, how long did it take us to kind of feel like we were really free? So we started feeling it when we did hear the angels. The angels did start singing, and then we did feel joy. But then there's this other piece of it, which is that God's presence in the world is weakened while we are weakened. Interesting idea, folks. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there is a sphere of, I wouldn't even say it's theology, it's more mythology, which is that gods are given power by their people. Mm-hmm. And when the people are weak, God is weak. Watch or read Neil Gaiman if you want to get a little bit of that. So this exists in Judaism. It exists in Jewish theology, which is that if God isn't, God never is weak in the sense that God's always the creator, God is always God. But God's presence in the world, God's manifestation in this world, which is the Shekinah, the divine presence, is weakened when the Jewish people are weakened. And so this is an interesting idea, which is that some part of God in the world, at least, isn't the way it should be while Israel is in exile. Interesting idea, and one that kind of begs the question again, why? Why does that happen? Why is God's presence diminished ever at all? But it also explains, why are the Jewish people stronger at certain points? Why does it seem like God is with us, or giving us extra energy? This is the explanation, which is that it's kind of like a loop. How do you get into that cycle? God intervenes to make this cycle get back on track, but that's what we had just now. So things feel better and smell better. God's presence is starting to come back into the world and starting to come back to bring life to the world, which is another reason why, of course, Passover is the season of springtime, because it's celebrated at a time when the world is coming back to life. That imagery is not as much of a priority to the Jewish people when they're no longer farmers. But when they're farmers, the harvest of spring and the Passover experience are a yearly nexus point for life. And there was a time when we were farmers in the land of Israel, and now we, of course, are again. But when the land comes back to life, it's a yearly affirmation in the natural world of life coming back and God's redemption being manifested in the natural world, if you will. So that's something, again, we don't think as much about, but of course we have our Passover traditions of remembering and celebrating spring, revitalization around us during that time. All right, now let's get ready to start getting out.
The exodus of the Israelites began at Ramses, and although the distance from there to the city of Mitzrayim, where Moses abode, was a 40 days journey, yet they heard the voice of their leader urging them to leave the land. They covered the distance from Ramses to Sukkot, a 3 days march, in an instant. In Sukkot, God enveloped them in 7 clouds of glory, 4 hovering in front, behind, and at the 2 sides of them, 1 suspended above them to keep off rain, hail, and the rays of the sun, and 1 under them to protect them against thorns and snakes. The 7th cloud preceded them and prepared the way for them, exalting the valleys and making low every mountain and hill. Thus they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. In all that time, no artificial lighting was needed. A beam from the celestial cloud followed them into the darkest of chambers. And if one of the people had to go outside of the camp, even there he was accompanied by a fold of the cloud, covering and protecting him. Only that a difference might be made between day and night, a pillar of fire took the place of the cloud in the evening. Never for an instant were the people without the one or the other to guide them. The pillar of fire glowed in front of them before the pillar of cloud retired, and in the morning the cloud was there before the fire vanished. The clouds of glory and the pillar of fire were sent for the protection of Israel alone, for none beside, not for the heathen and not for the mixed multitude that went up with them. These had to walk outside of the cloud enclosure.
So here's a weird, it's all kind of like, what happened, right? First of all, there's a lot here, but one of the most important things is that the Israelites were protected by God the whole time. From the moment they left Egypt, they were protected. And the weird thing here is that it was never really dark. They never had anything to worry about. There was no darkness, like no darkness, which I guess would kind of get grating over after a while, and that you kind of like
What
it.
if you wanted to sleep?
Guess you had to put on those things over
You have to put on a nightshade, you know.
nightshade. Yeah.
Nightshade.
So, but this idea that the wandering was never that scary. What they're trying to say is that they always knew God was there around them, always, and they always were protected. And they didn't even have a chance to get, like most of us when we're walking around in the mud and the dirt and walking through the wilderness, we get cut up a little bit. No, no. The clouds, the protection was all around us. Our shoes didn't even get worn. I mean, that's actually, there's a midrash that our shoes didn't even get worn because we never touched the ground. We were protected all the time. And so it was so protected, it was even hard to tell whether it was night or day because we were always in the light and there's nothing to worry about. No animals, never could get a flat tire, never ran out of gas. We were always protected. So, and even the journeys weren't normal because it didn't take us very long to go from one place to another, which is kind of, again, strange because we know that it took them a couple months to get to Mount Sinai, but some of the journey, I guess you could say, happened quicker than was miraculous, if you will, that they were not walking at a normal speed, if you will, which would make sense when you have 600,000 men. Again, it wasn't 600,000 people, according to the Torah, it's 600,000 men. And that's a question of even, were those people, how many of those people were also tagging along, which we're about to read.
The cavalcade consisted of 600,000 heads of families afoot, each accompanied by 5 children on horseback, and to these must be added the mixed multitude, exceeding the Hebrews vastly in number. So profound was Israel's trust in the Lord that they followed Moses unmurmuringly into the wilderness without supplying themselves with provisions. The only edibles they took were the remains of the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs, and these not to satisfy their hunger, but because they were unwilling to separate themselves from what they had prepared lovingly at the command of God. These possessions were so dear to them that they would not entrust them to the beasts of burden. They carried them on their own shoulders.
Yep. So a couple things there. The first is, yes, it says 600,000 men, which means there were a lot of kids and wives. And according to this, a mixed multitude, an Erev Rav, which is the Hebrew word for lots of swarms of people. The rabbis took that literally to mean that there were a lot of people who came along that were not Israelites, or at least fully Israelite. A mixed multitude of people. So, by the way, according to the rabbis, this was one of the reasons why there was so much trouble ahead, was because the people, you can blame it on the masses, you get the mixed crowd of people who really didn't know any better but tagged along. I will say that there's slightly racist overtones in that, but again, it's not a color racial thing more than an ethnic, who's your tribe, that you're Egyptian. But this idea that there were not just Israelites that left is an interesting idea. And it's one that we don't really get much of later on. It doesn't seem like it necessarily was the case that a lot of non-Israelites left, but the possibility that non-Israelites left that joined the group is interesting. Again, later on, there are Israelites that get punished there are a couple people mentioned during the book of Numbers who are not fully Israelite, who are part Israelite, part Egyptian. So there definitely were mixed marriages here, Moses being one of them. But this idea that there are people that are hangers on is an important one, because it at least allows for people who want to get on the good path to do the right thing. So that at least is out there. So it says the only edibles that the people took was the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs, which then
I want to think of when I hear edibles nowadays.
there's a reason for it, because in a couple of moments, even before they're out of the land, they're going to start grumbling and moaning about what they don't have. So first of all, it reminds us that Passover is a yearly recreation of this moment, that we actually took the bread out with us, and they were important, and we didn't put them in our packs. We literally put them on carried them out ourselves, carried them on our shoulders, which it says they did. Why? Because they realized how important this food was. But on the other hand, it was not the food you want to take with you on the road. And so it does allow for the next scene, which is they're complaining about the fact they don't have bread and they don't have normal stuff, and they don't have, because they got unleavened bread. So they complain about it. And the Torah does say that they took it. So the Midrash rectifies those two things with, yeah, they took it because it was important, and they didn't even, so important, they wouldn't even put it in their packs. But it wasn't exactly good food for traveling, but they was meaningful to them, and it's meaningful to us. And that is the end of that volume. Because if you see, now we got to go into a new volume, which I knew we were going to at least touch into and get into. And so we now come into the next volume of Ginsburg's collection of how he ordered this, which is a good break right here. Which is now we're on the road. So let's take a look, and we're going to finish with these chapters. We're not going to get to the Red Sea, or we're going to get to the Red Sea, but we're not going to cross the Red Sea today. So let's read what happens when we're on our journey.
The exodus would have been impossible if Joseph's bones had remained behind. Therefore, Moses made it his concern to seek their resting place, while the people had but the one thought of gathering in the treasures of the Egyptians. But it was not an easy matter to find Joseph's body. Moses knew that he had been interred in the mausoleum of the Egyptian kings, but there were so many other bodies there that it was impossible to identify it. Moses' mother Yocheved came to his aid. She led him to the very spot where Joseph's bones lay. As soon as he came near them, he knew them to be what he was seeking by the fragrance they exhaled and spread around. But his difficulties were not at an end. The question arose how he was to secure possession of the remains. Joseph's coffin had been sunk far down into the ground, and he knew not how to raise it from the depths. Standing at the edge of the grave, he spoke these words, "Joseph, the time has come, whereof you did say, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry out my bones from hence." No sooner had this reminder dropped from his lips than the coffin stirred and rose to the surface.
Well, that's a pretty spooky scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one that is very prominent in the Midrash, because the Torah tells us that they took Joseph's bones, that this indeed happened in the Torah. It's, by the way, also a scene in the Ten Commandments. Quick scene, but it's still a very powerful scene where one of the children says, "What is that?" And they said that this is the coffin of Joseph. So they fulfill this promise. It's a promise that takes generations to fulfill, but yet they fulfill it. So it's a beautiful it's a beautiful midrash. It's also, again, one that a woman helps in this, which is in one version Moses' mother Yocheved. In the more famous version, actually, it's Serach. It's the last living link to those people who's still alive. Asher's daughter, one of the people that came down with Joseph during Joseph's time, is his niece, Serach. And Serach is the wise woman who knows where these things are. But here's, maybe she didn't make it to this day. They finally have to have somebody, maybe she just recently passed on. I mean, who knows? The point is that in the Midrash collections, oftentimes it is a woman, a wise woman, who knows where his body is, or at least can give Moses the information of where he's supposed to go. But it's also usually accompanied with a miraculous rising of Joseph's bones, or the being able to find where his bones are, and that people didn't know, people forgot. They were buried, it was desecrated, but that the bones miraculously come back and are able to be there. And as I mentioned in the Wednesday night class, the interesting thing about Joseph's bones is that in Hebrew, the word for a coffin is an aron, a cabinet, the holder. It's a coffin, but it's also Aron HaKodesh. It's also the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant. It's the Aron that we have in our synagogues today, where the Torah is. So the word both means a coffin, and it means a casket, and it also means the cabinet or the holder for something very important. The word's the same in Hebrew. And it's interesting to think that as the Jews wandered in the wilderness, or were exiled in the wilderness, or making their way through the wilderness for 40 years, for most of those 40 years, they had two arks: an ark of bone of their ancestor Joseph, of our ancestor, and the ark of the covenant, the ark of the law. They had two arks with them. So this is the miracle of Joseph's bones, which was part of the redemption. Part of leaving Egypt was to fulfill this promise that Joseph was going to come home. So here we go. Some more interesting midrashim.
And even yet, the difficulties in Moses' way were not removed wholly. The Egyptian magicians had stationed 2 golden dogs at Joseph's coffin to keep watch, and they barked vehemently if anyone ventured close to it. The noise they made was so loud it could be heard throughout the land from end to end, a distance equal to a 40 days' journey. When Moses came near the coffin, the dogs emitted their warning sound, but he silenced them at once with words. "Come, you people, and behold the miracle. The real live dogs did not bark, and these counterfeit dogs produced by magic attempted." What he said about real live dogs and the refraining from barking had reference to the fact that the dogs of the Egyptians did not move their tongues against any of the children of Israel. Though they had barked all the time, the people were engaged in burying the bodies of their smitten firstborn. As a reward, God gave the Israelites the law to cast to the dogs the flesh they themselves are forbidden to eat. For the Lord withholds due recompense from none of his creatures. Indeed, the dogs received a double reward, for their excrements are used in tanning the hides from which the Torah scrolls are made, as well as the mezuzot and the phylacteries.
Yeah, you might not have known that. You might not have known that that's what we use dog poo for. I never heard that. I mean, I don't know.
I actually found that in the writings of the English humorist Terry Pratchett.
I thought it was just urine.
No, they used apparently, well, at least according to the book I was reading, they used the poo, but it was very, very fine.
Yeah, it look, they're not making it up. The people would use those kinds of, there was traditions that people had for this. Clearly they didn't make that up. That was used for curing hides. but this is a very famous line in the Torah. In Exodus, it says the dogs did not whelp. The dogs did not make a noise. The dogs did not bark. Whatever your translation of the Bible is, when the Israelites left, the dogs didn't make a noise. Now, that's a miracle. It's not a huge miracle, but it's a miracle, because normally when you walk by a house, a dog will bark. The Egyptians, by the way, were not dog people, so it's kind of an interesting Midrash when you, actually line in the Torah. It's the Midrash builds on it. But these are because these are wild dogs. These are not like friendly. They're not like my little dog Ryder, right? The golden doodle. These are dogs that are not dogs you want to mess with. I don't want to say who has dogs like this, but there are people I know who have dogs that look scary. Now, that being said, they're rewarded for their good behavior. Dogs get rewarded. And this is a big deal because, again, Jews didn't keep dogs as pets either. It wasn't like we suddenly became dog people at this moment. We would have been having dogs bark at us, and the dogs didn't, and they're rewarded for it. They're rewarded by getting to have whatever they want when they sit at your table or working out in the fields when you throw them your scraps. That's what they get. They get, of all the animals, the ones that get food that usually comes off our plates is a dog. How weird is that? The Midrash explains that. The Midrash explains why dogs get rewarded. And again, these magical, mechanical dogs that the Egyptians used to keep people away and not be able to get Joseph buried is a wonderful Midrash, because it tells us the Egyptians thought that his bones had power, and they didn't want the Jews to have that power of Joseph's bones, because Joseph was so powerful in life that they kept his bones, because maybe as long as they had the bones, they had the magic. So the juju of Joseph's bones, or the jojo, Joseph's bones, is something that they don't want to give up, but yet they're going to lose that too. So dogs, this is how dogs, we don't have a lot about dogs in the Midrash, by the way. We don't have a lot about dogs in the Torah. We don't have a lot about dogs because people didn't normally keep dogs as pets. They kept them in their employ, if you will, because they had them as watchdogs, and they had them as dogs to take care of their their shepherd dogs, right? They had them, started to have them early on because they made good, they were loyal, and they didn't make, at a certain point, make sense to have them around, but they weren't Chihuahuas. These are not little pet dogs. They go in
fight rats.
your handbags. These are what?
They fight rats, don't they?
Interestingly, the Talmud says that's what you do with cats. Cats are good for getting rid of your mice and your varmint, your critters that are crawling around your house. The rabbis recommend cats for that reason. So the rabbis actually in the Talmud recommend cats because they help keep a house clean and free of non-kosher animals that would otherwise mess your house up. But not so with dogs. They don't put dogs in that same category, probably because dogs probably, as much as it says they get the scraps, it probably didn't mean what it means for us, which is we toss a few things off the table to the dog's mouth that's waiting right underneath our legs. It's probably tossed out in the back where the dog was, because these were not household pet dogs that go in your handbag. So these were dogs that got to eat from their masters, but they also can eat garbage. They can eat anything, and they can even eat food that isn't kosher, which is really, really cool for dogs, because dogs get to eat anything they want. I guess you could say cats do as well, because they're going to eat mice and stuff that isn't kosher to eat. But dogs get to eat everything. They get to eat food. They get to eat treif. They get to eat. And treif, by the way, includes meat that didn't get killed in a kosher way. So they get to eat things that nobody else would eat. And
But
actually,
I seem to remember, Mark,
Yeah.
they used to put out, the grocery stores, at least back east, used to put out a booklet as to what didn't need the kosher for Passover markings on it.
yep.
And I seem to remember that there was a whole section on dog food and that it did need to have something on it. Am I wrong?
Because people have this issue of bringing the food into their house, right? And for Passover, first of all, for Passover, you weren't supposed to bring non-kosher for Passover food, even to feed your dog, which was kind of ironic. But again, if it had grain in it, because a lot of dog food has grain in it, it's just not the main ingredient. But you're not supposed to bring in that kind of dog food. So bringing in dog food for Passover was an issue because you couldn't bring in the stuff with grain. That's a slightly different issue.
Okay.
But the issue of having dogs be able to eat whatever they want is a very important Talmudic principle, because what makes something like a bone, you can use a bone you can use stuff for dogs. As long as it's not fit for human consumption, it's okay. If dogs can eat it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's food. So food for a dog is actually a Talmudic classification for things that may not be food anymore. Came from an animal, but no longer food. So a dog would eat it, but you wouldn't eat it. So you could use it. So for example, we don't eat the skin of an animal usually. You can use a pig skin for a football because it's not going to be eaten by me. Dog may eat it. You wouldn't eat it. So there's things that dogs would eat that humans don't eat, and but they're not necessarily not kosher. Also remember, treif isn't just non-kosher animals. It's an animal that died on its own, that died of illness. Dog can eat it. So you have a sheep out in the backyard, all of a sudden it dies. You can't eat it. It's not kosher. You didn't kill it. You didn't have it die in a painless way, which, by the way, probably kept Jews alive for a lot longer than other people who just ate whatever fell into their laps. They weren't so picky, if you will. So Jews who said, you know what, we're not allowed to eat that animal, probably kept a lot of people alive because a lot of those animals were infested with disease. Dog can eat it. And by the way, sometimes dogs can eat stuff that you and I would die from, but a dog can eat it, process it, and because it doesn't have a stomach and intestine like us, it's just fine. But there are people, there's people food and there's dog food, and it's not always the same. So that is actually a rabbinic category of
Food for dogs.
Food for dogs. And there are people, there was an argument, by the way, which didn't pass muster, but if we had lived in different age, perhaps it would have. But there was an argument many decades ago over gelatin.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument with gelatin was nobody eats bones of horses and dogs and cats and cows and whatever weird stuff is in your gelatin. It's not food. It's not food. It's bone. It's ground bone, and we don't eat it. So couldn't it be kosher from the standpoint of, yeah, dog would eat it, but you and I wouldn't eat it? Didn't pass muster because it's still food and you're not supposed to eat non-kosher animals. So they said, doesn't work. But there was an argument made. It was a logical argument, which was, it's bone. It's not food anymore. So, but again, that is a argument that, again, people weren't going to go with. And so gelatin is still an issue of kashrut for some people, and people who won't have non-kosher gelatin, there are lots of foods that they will consequently not make their kosher list because it has gelatin in it, which comes from bone of animals that are not kosher sometimes. So without being too graphic, that's what's in your gelatin. Not that most of us eat that much Jell-O, but if you do,
And marshmallows too.
I will say yes. It's in lots of other things that we don't always think about, but there's a lot of artificial gelatin now too. So there are a lot of opportunities for people to have marshmallows and other stuff if they want to keep kosher and not eat non-kosher gelatin. But food for dogs, just so you know, that is for all of those dog lovers out there. This is our little dog midrash, which is again, important one, not just for dogs, but for all animals, which is that God takes care of everybody, including everything, all animals. So dog poop even has a place. Dog poop. There's a place for dog poop in our lives. Not in my life. I want it as far away from me as possible. And guess what? At 4:00 in the morning, I was cleaning dog poop off of my floor. So yeah, I don't need it. I wasn't making any tefillin this morning, so I really didn't need to do that. But yeah, that's for real. I guess I didn't know that I would be reading this morning. Take comfort in the knowledge that yes, there's a place for that even in the world. Not in my hand at 4:00 in the morning, but somebody could use it one day at some point. All right.
For several reasons, God did not permit the Israelites to travel along the straight route to the promised land. He desired them to go to Sinai first and take the law upon themselves there. And besides, the time divinely appointed.
You missed one paragraph.
Oh, did I?
Joseph's coffin. Yeah, just read this one quick.
Joseph's coffin in the possession of Moses, the march of Israelites could begin. The Israelites put no more obstacle in their way. Pharaoh himself accompanied them to make sure they were actually leaving the land. And now he was so angry at his counselors for having advised against letting the Israelites depart that he slew them.
Which is the mark. That's the mark of a complete deranged dictator, but very real, which is I'm going to punish the people whose, advice I took and then went against that advice. And I'm still going to kill them because that's what I do. I'm going to blame everybody but myself. I will kill my own counselors. But that Pharaoh accompanied the people himself. I want to make sure these people are getting out of the country. I really want them gone. I want to see them with my own eyes get out of the country. So yeah, Pharaoh killed his counselors, which of course is the mark of a true dictator. Just ask the dictators who are still in power. All right. Some of them are dead. All right. But yeah, let's get now to why they go the long way.
For several reasons, God did not permit the Israelites to travel along the straight road to the promised land. He desired them to go to Sinai first and take the law upon themselves there, and besides, the time divinely appointed for the occupation of the land by the Gentiles had not yet elapsed. Over and above all this, the long sojourn in the wilderness was fraught with profit for the Israelites, spiritually and materially. If they had reached Palestine directly after leaving Egypt, they would have devoted themselves entirely each to the cultivation of his allotted parcel of ground, and no time would have been left for the study of the Torah. In the wilderness, they were relieved of the necessity of providing for their daily wants, and they would give all their efforts to acquiring the law. On the whole, it would not have been advantageous to process at once to the Holy Land and take possession thereof. For when the Canaanites heard that the Israelites were making for Palestine, they burnt the crops, felled the trees, destroyed the buildings, and choked the water springs, all in order to render the land uninhabitable. Hereupon God spoke and said, I did not promise their fathers to give a devastated land unto their seed, but a land full of all good things. I will lead them about in the wilderness for 40 years, and meanwhile the Canaanites will have time to repair the damage they have done. Moreover, the many miracles performed for the Israelites during the journey through the wilderness had made their terror to fall upon the other nations, and their hearts melted, and there remained no more spirit in any man. They did not venture to attack the Israelites, and the conquest of the land was all the easier.
Yeah, so this still gets back to the question of the fact that God needed them to be in the wilderness for 40 years, which kind of ruins the drama of being punished. But the Torah tells us that it's because of the not having to fight a war. But of course, they fight a war by the end of the chapter. They're fighting the Amalekites. So it can't just be not fighting wars, because even if that war was punishment and not plan, it's not good. It's not a good enough reason for the people to go through this. So what we have is other reasons. There are a lot of reasons. One of them is the people have to go through training. They got to be ready. Otherwise, they're just going to come in and think this is all about having a land to live in. It's not. It's about living a whole different lifestyle. It's being ready spiritually, mentally, emotionally, getting yourself together. That's one. But wait, there's more. There was this problem that the Canaanites heard that the Israelites were coming and then devastated the land so it wouldn't be ready for them, which seems kind of crazy, but not uncommon, where people who know that they're about to be invaded take all their crops, harvest them, and then burn everything else so there's nothing left for the invaders to have. Kind of crazy, but happened. You could do that when you had walls and a fortress that you could retire back into. I went on a binge watching last night, by the way, of I get drawn into the Viking Saxon stuff. So I started watching Last Kingdom last night. I couldn't stop watching it. But this idea of people fighting for, for their lives would sometimes have to put themselves in, really weird circumstances in order to be redeemed. Well, maybe that happened on the Canaanite side. But again, one of the most important reasons is God's got a lot more miracles. There's a whole lot more happening for you guys. And so we need time. You need to be seasoned, as we would say. You need some seasoning. And that seasoning comes with 40 years. So kind of weird to think that this was all a setup. There's more reasons. We'll probably finish with maybe this paragraph or the next one. Yep.
Nor does this exhaust the list of reasons for preferring a longer route through the desert. Abraham had sworn a solemn oath to live at peace with the Philistines during a certain period, and the end of the term had not yet arrived. Besides, there was the fear that the sight of the land of the Philistines would awaken sad recollections in the Israelites and drive them back into Egypt speedily, for once upon a time it had been the scene of bitter disappointment to them. They had spent 180 years in Egypt in peace and prosperity, not in the least molested by the people. Suddenly Ganon came, a descendant of Joseph of the tribe of Ephraim, and he spoke, "The Lord has appeared to me, and he bade me lead you forth out of Egypt." The Ephraimites were the only ones to heed his words. Proud of their royal lineage as direct descendants of Joseph, and confident in their valor in war, for they were great heroes, they left the land and betook themselves to Palestine. They carried only weapons and gold and silver. They had taken no provisions because they expected to buy food and drink on the way or capture them by force if the owners would not part with them for money.
Keep going.
After a day's march, they found themselves in the neighborhood of Gath, at the place where the shepherds employed by the residents of the city gathered with their flocks. The Ephraimites asked them to sell them some sheep, which they expected to slaughter in order to satisfy their hunger with them. But the shepherds refused to have business dealings with them, saying, "Are the sheep ours, or does the cattle belong to us, that we could part with them for money?" Seeing that they could not gain their point by kindness, the Ephraimites used force. The outcries of the shepherds brought the people of Gath to their aid. A violent encounter lasting a whole day took place between the Israelites and the Philistines. The people of Gath realized that alone they would not be able to offer successful resistance to the Ephraimites, and they summoned the people of the other Philistine cities to join them. The following day, an army of 40,000 stood ready to oppose the Ephraimites. Reduced in strength as they were by their 3 days' fast, they were exterminated, root and branch. Only 10 of them escaped with their bare life and returned to Egypt, to bring Ephraim word of the disaster that had overtaken his posterity, and he mourned many days.
Wow. So that's something you may never have heard of, which is kind of a weird tale of a first attempt to get back home by the tribe of Ephraim, or at least part of the tribe of Ephraim. And that they go through the Philistine land and end up getting routed. It's a strange legend, and maybe one that either is a retention of an old story of why the Israelites had not left before, or a story that kind of keeps alive this idea that there are times when the Israelites thought they could win a war, maybe in more modern times to when this was written, or more recent times during the Greco-Roman period, where they thought that they could go to war and it was too early. So whether it was the revolt against the Romans, the first revolt against the Romans during the time of Vespasian and Titus, or whether it was the revolt against the Romans during Bar Kokhba revolt against Hadrian, this idea that, again, you got to wait for the right time. This is a midrash about an early attempt at getting out of Egypt, which again is not one that was very well known, but is based on a really important idea, which is that maybe the Israelites did try to leave. Maybe they did try to leave, and maybe it even happened before things had gotten really bad in Egypt. They just wanted to get home. All right, well, let's read this last paragraph of this midrash, this strange abortive attempt at escape, or going back home, if you will. Hardly escape yet, because things hadn't gotten too bad yet. All right.
This abortive attempt of the Ephraimites to leave Egypt was the first occasion for oppressing Israel. Thereafter, the Egyptians exercised force and vigilance to keep them in their land. As for the disaster of the Ephraimites, it was well-merited punishment, because they had paid no heed to the wish of their father Joseph, who had adjured his descendants solemnly on his deathbed not to think of quitting the land until the Redeemer should appear. Their death was followed by disgrace, for their bodies lay unburied for many years on the battlefield near Gath. And the purpose of God in directing the Israelites to choose the longer route from Egypt to Canaan was to spare them the sight of those dishonored corpses. Their courage might have deserted them, and out of apprehension of sharing the fate of their brethren, they might have hastened back to the land of slavery.
Wow. So according to this, hundreds of years later, bodies are still left unburied. So it's a interesting midrash based on, again, why did they not go through the land of the Philistines, which is what the Torah says. They went the long route. They didn't go along the Mediterranean. They went around the interior route. They went through the desert. Now, again, the Torah tells us that God chose that route because they didn't want them to fight. Well, at least not fighting until they get ready, and until they're coming in the right direction, and until they follow the way that God wants them to, which again might not just be a direction, but might require time and seasoning. And as we know, a new generation that's ready to do this. But the weird thing, of course, is that the Israelites are indeed going to fight. They're going to fight the Amalekites almost immediately. We'll get into that midrash coming up, but that is right after they cross the sea of the Red Sea. Right after that, they are engaged in battle. So as much as the Torah says that God didn't want them to fight, they do fight, and they fight right then. There aren't a lot of fights, again, for the rest of the time. They don't start fighting again with the Amorites until the battle against Sihon and Og, which is right before they cross into the land. So for 38 years, 39 years, there are no battles. That is definitely a part of their existence. the wilderness wasn't easy, but it wasn't fought with external enemies. The enemies the Jews deal with, we deal with in the desert, are internal enemies. They're ourselves. It's ourselves. It's food and hunger, disease or lack of water. Those definitely seem to elicit responses, but at every point they're kind of answered, and the answers are just going to give us more reason to be disappointed, if you will, to some extent. So we'll pick this up next week. Pharaoh pursuing the Hebrews, which of course is going to lead to the crossing of the Red Sea. So this next week, we are going to read next Tuesday. Please join us where we actually will read the wonderful Midrash on the sea divided. Some of it you've heard, some of it was used in the movie, The Ten Commandments, very dramatically. Some of it was used in the movie, Prince of Egypt. Beautiful music during that time. Those are all things to remind us. If you want to go back and watch a little bit of that too, not bad to watch a little Prince of Egypt or the music or 10 Commandments. Everybody, I'm glad you were here. Stay safe. Stay healthy. I hope to hear more people getting vaccinated and taking whatever steps they can to be healthy and get through these next weeks. But again, as we get closer, it gets harder to some extent, and it may even get darker, but let's hope maybe the darkness is done. So everybody, will see you, God willing, next week. And everybody, thank you again, Rosemary, for leading us and reading this.
Welcome. Bye, everybody.
Take care. It's great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.